can't believe you would say that to me! After everything I've done for this family!
My name is Lauren Hayes. I'm 28, and until the afternoon, my mother told me I didn't live there anymore. I believed a house could forgive. I had the keys on my ring, the scent of lemon cleaner and laundry sheets mapped somewhere in the back of my throat. The muscle memory that guides you to the old cereal bowls without even turning on the lights. When I turned the handle that day, rain pinpricked the porch in a steady whisper, and I still thought of the place on Maple Street as home. Stubbornly, naively, like a child squeezing a shell to her ear and insisting the ocean really is inside. My mother opened the door halfway, a wedge of light cutting across the wet boards, and her face didn't register surprise or joy. It registered decision. "Lauren," she said evenly, like reading a label. Then, with a flinty calm that made my palms go cold, "You don't live here anymore." There are sentences that slice through time. You remember the exact temperature, the crooked button on your coat, the way your heartbeat pauses like a missed step on a dark staircase. I stood there with a canvas tote sliding off my shoulder and my work blazer damp at the cuffs, and my first reflex wasn't anger, it was confusion, the kind that makes the world tilt. I had not come with demands. I had come for something small, maybe to borrow a slow cooker for Sunday, maybe to unspool a little of the week's exhaustion in that kitchen where the faucet always squeaked. The edges of the door bit into the brass plate. I heard the distant hum of the refrigerator inside, the tick of the old hall clock that had chaperoned birthday parties and flu seasons and report card nights. "What?" I said uselessly, as if asking the word could reverse it. In documentaries, they often roll archival footage while a voiceover explains the moment history split. I imagine that now, home video grain across the frame, my mother in younger years stirring a pot, me at 7 with a gap-toothed smile, then a hard cut to the present, rain and the word anymore echoing like a gavel. The truth is, families rarely break with a bang. They fray, thread by thread, then suddenly you're holding a handful of string and insisting there was a sweater here a second ago. We like to believe that unlike the market or the weather or the fragile screens we live through, family is the durable thing. But if you ask therapists, social workers, clergy, they'll tell you estrangement has been rising. Somewhere I once read that 1 in 4 adults experiences prolonged distance from a parent or sibling. Numbers make it sound clinical. Nothing about the way my throat closed felt clinical. "Mom," I tried again, choosing the smaller word over mother, because it used to be softer, because there was a time when it meant a hand on the forehead and a second helping, not a hinge closing. Her eyes flicked past my shoulder as if she were checking the street for witnesses or waiting for weather to change. Maybe she had been rehearsing this line in empty rooms. Maybe it still surprised her to hear it aloud. "You made your choices," she said. It was the tone she used when I left for a job she didn't understand, when I dated someone she thought took me away from the family, when I questioned the annual traditions she considered sacred. And we need our peace. Our. Words that cast me outside the circle in a single breath. She had always believed in the warmth of plural things. Our table, our holidays, our roof. Now the plural excluded me. I noticed the wreath on the door was new. Eucalyptus and white berries, understated. And the welcome mat had been flipped, so the word welcome faced the house instead of the street. The rain gathered at the edge of the awning and fell in a line like beads breaking. I told myself to breathe, to ground in the details like the mindfulness app says. Smell of rain, sound of clock, cool of the brass. It did not stop the sting. There are 100 reasons families split, and none of them explain the feeling. The story you'll hear later, because every family drafts one, will say I had grown distant, rebellious, ungrateful. Another version will say my mother had grown controlling, rigid, more invested in appearances than in the daughter who never learned to fit a template. The truth is messy and braided. It lives between the scripts. Two women who loved each other, two different definitions of home. Hers, a place made orderly by rules. Mine, a place made safe by acceptance. I wish I could say I argued then, that I delivered a righteous monologue framed by the doorway, like stage light. But children, even adult ones, still calibrate themselves to a parent's face. I saw the set of her jaw and heard the verdict already filed. Can I at least... I gestured vaguely toward the hallway, the place where the umbrella stand squatted like a little sentry, where a shoelace always trailed. My key, absurdly heavy now, pressed against my fingers inside my coat pocket. You don't live here anymore, she repeated, gentler only by degrees, like offering the same bitter medicine with a sip of water. Behind her, the hall smelled of furniture polish. The family photos lined the wall. My brother at Little League, me in a recital tutu, all of us on a beach trip the summer before things got complicated. It's amazing how the past can look well-behaved when you frame it and backlight it. I thought of the Christmas a year ago when I cut short our gathering because the conversation turned into a tribunal on my life choices. How an aunt had raised her glass with a smile that felt like a warning and toasted to those who remember what matters, and everyone laughed as if laughter itself were proof of moral clarity. I left that night with the kind of headache fluorescent lights give you. I told myself time would sand down the sharpness. Instead, it made this edge. I wanted to ask who we meant. My mother and the walls? My mother and the story she needed. But I have learned this. When someone has decided you are a disruption, asking for definitions will not grant you a place. Okay, I said, though nothing was okay. I stepped back into the weather, and the door clicked shut with a politeness that felt crueler than a slam. On the porch, the overhang stuttered with drip. Across the street, a dog barked once, then reconsidered. For a moment, I stood under that awning with my backstrap biting my shoulder and let the rain thicken. I used to think the hardest part of adulthood would be the bills, the deadlines, the quiet hours when no one tells you dinner is ready. No one warns you about exile by sentence, how the geography of your life reshapes around an absence. If this were only a personal diary, I might stop here and cry onto the page. But stories, even true ones told slant, have obligations. I want to show you the fault lines that led to this doorway, the small misunderstandings calcified into doctrine, the holidays that asked us to perform intimacy we hadn't practiced, the economics of caretaking and expectation, the way words said in anger lodge in the body like shrapnel. I want to show you, too, the other side of the map, the spare apartment I found, the friend who left soup on the stoop, the late-night scrolling where I learned I'm not alone. There's a statistic that says conflict avoided becomes conflict multiplied. I don't know if my mother read that line somewhere and mistook eviction for resolution, or if I did and mistook silence for grace. What matters for now is the hinge, the sentence, the rain. I walked down the steps slowly, careful not to slip, the way you walk in a museum around fragile things. I held the key in my fist until the serrations marked my palm, and then put it back on the ring, absurdly unwilling to remove it yet. Maybe you don't return keys the day the house stops recognizing you. Maybe you carry them a while as a talisman, a stubborn bet on miracle. On the sidewalk, the elm trees held their leaves like damp paper. A car crawled by, wipers beating time. I told myself I would make sense of it later, that there is a way to narrate even the most unspeakable moments until they fit a frame. This is how my world shattered. Not with a blowout fight, not with spectacle, but with a measured voice at a familiar door. And if you stay with me, I'll show you how. The shards cut and what they taught me about home, love, and the strange, stubborn human capacity to turn pain into a path, because a house can forget. But a heart, stubborn in its own way, can learn to live with doors that don't open, and sometimes, by some unglamorous grace, find new ones. The first night in my apartment was a strange quiet, the kind that hums louder than traffic. I had been there before, of course, moving boxes and sorting kitchenware, but never as someone without a home to return to. My lease paperwork lay on the counter beside a bottle of cheap wine I hadn't opened. The walls were bare, pale beige, the kind of neutral landlords choose so no one complains. I stood barefoot on the laminate floor and stared at the ceiling, listening to the radiator hiss, and told myself this was adulthood, independence, freedom, choice. But beneath those words was another one I couldn't shake. Exile. The truth is, my mother and I had been on this collision course for years. We just pretended we weren't. The small cracks had been forming long before the day she told me I didn't live there anymore. They were there in the conversations we avoided, in the polite smiles we offered instead of apologies, in the way I stopped calling every day because every conversation turned into a lecture. It was easier to tell myself she didn't mean it, easier to laugh off the criticism as just mom being mom. But the cracks widened. It started with my choice of career. I had left law school after one semester, something she had proudly announced to every relative at every holiday dinner, and took a job in marketing. "You're wasting your potential," she said when I told her. "You could be someone important." It didn't matter that I liked my work, that it gave me purpose and creativity. In her eyes, I had stepped off the path she had laid out for me before I was even born. And in that family, stepping off the path was the same as disappearing. Then there was the matter of Ethan, my partner of 4 years. He was kind, gentle, thoughtful. He treated me with respect. But he also came from a working-class background, something my mother never said was a problem, but always hinted at. "Are you sure he'll be able to provide?" she asked once over dinner, in that carefully measured tone that made the question sound like concern instead of judgment. "You grew up used to a certain lifestyle." What she meant was, "He's not good enough for you." What I heard was, "You're disappointing me again." Holidays became battlegrounds. Every visit home meant preparing myself for criticism dressed as advice. "When are you two getting married?" "You're too old to be renting an apartment." "Why don't you call more?" I would sit at the table, smiling politely, chewing my food slowly, trying not to let the words burrow too deep. I loved her. I wanted her approval, but I also wanted to live my own life, and those two desires were constantly at war. The real breaking point, though, came 2 years before she closed the door on me. It was Christmas. We were all gathered in the living room, the tree glowing in the corner, the smell of cinnamon and pine hanging in the air. My mother had invited extended family, aunts, cousins, people I barely knew, and at some point, after too many glasses of wine, the conversation turned toward me. "Lauren still hasn't made partner," my uncle said, and the room chuckled, thinking it was a joke. "She's still in advertising," my mother added, not cruelly, but with that sharpness that made it sting worse. "But I suppose everyone finds their level eventually." I laughed. I always laughed, because the alternative was crying. Later that night, I stood in the kitchen, scraping plates into the trash when she came in behind me. "You know, I only say those things because I want you to do better," she said. "You could have so much more." I remember gripping the edge of the counter so tightly my knuckles went white. "Maybe this is what I want," I said. She sighed. "You don't know what you want." And that was when I realized we weren't speaking the same language anymore. For her, love meant control, shaping me into the version of myself she believed would be safe, successful, acceptable. For me, love meant being seen, flaws and all, and still being welcomed. We were both trying to love each other, but our definitions were incompatible. And every time we tried to bridge that gap, we made it wider. I tried to pull back, to create distance before we said things we couldn't take back. I skipped a few family gatherings. I stopped updating her on every detail of my life. And instead of seeing it as an act of self-preservation, she saw it as betrayal. "You're abandoning this family," she said during one of our last phone calls before the eviction day. "No," I told her quietly. "I'm trying to save it." But saving something requires both people to want it saved. Looking back, I can see how the resentment built in her. I can see how every choice I made that was different from the one she envisioned felt like a rejection of her sacrifices. She had worked 2 jobs when I was a kid. She had given up vacations, nights out, hobbies, all so I could have opportunities she never did. And instead of following the script she wrote, I wrote my own. In her mind, that wasn't independence. That was ingratitude. It's easy from the outside to paint her as the villain, to say she was cruel, controlling, incapable of change. But life isn't a courtroom. There are no villains, only people clinging desperately to the stories they believe will keep them safe. And her story, the one that said good daughters do what's expected, was one she had lived her entire life. I was simply the first to question it. If I had understood that earlier, maybe I would have spoken differently. Maybe I would have listened more. Or maybe nothing would have changed. Because the truth is, even if I had been the perfect daughter, the cracks might still have formed. Expectations are heavy things, and sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who can't accept who you've become. The rain kept falling that night outside my apartment window, and for the first time I let myself feel the anger beneath the sadness, not at her, but at the lie we tell ourselves, that family is unconditional. It isn't. It never has been. It's a choice we make over and over again, to forgive, to try, to stay. And that night, I wasn't sure either of us was willing to choose it anymore. It had been 3 weeks since the day my mother told me I didn't live there anymore, and the words still replayed in my head like a line from a song I couldn't turn off. Every time I walked past a door, I heard it. Every time I tried to sleep, I heard it. You don't live here anymore. It was a sentence that didn't just push me out of a house, it pushed me out of a story. And yet, the story wasn't over. The call came on a Thursday evening while I was still at the office. Lauren, her voice said on the other end, clipped and cold, "I need you to stop by and pick up your things." My things, the phrasing felt deliberate, transactional, as if she were referring to a stranger's belongings left behind in a hotel room. "When?" I asked. "Tomorrow before noon. I'll leave them on the porch." And then she hung up. I told myself I wouldn't go. I told myself I didn't need to. But Friday morning, I found myself driving down Maple Street anyway, my chest tight with a mixture of anger and nostalgia. The house looked the same. White shutters, lilac bushes trimmed neatly. The same cracked walkway I used to race down as a child. But it wasn't mine anymore. I was a visitor now. There were 3 boxes on the porch, each labeled in her precise handwriting: clothes, books, miscellaneous. The word miscellaneous hurt more than I expected. I had lived in that house for 26 years. And now my life there had been distilled into 3 cardboard boxes and a label that meant everything else. I should have walked away. But when I glanced through the front window and saw the familiar glow of the living room lamp, something in me broke. I knocked, once, twice. The door opened just a crack. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I came to pick up my things." "They're outside. Can we talk?" Her lips tightened into a line. For a moment, I thought she might slam the door in my face. But then she stepped aside, wordless, and I walked in. The house smelled the same: coffee and furniture polish, the faint trace of lavender detergent. But it felt different, colder, smaller, like a museum exhibit of a life I no longer belonged to. The walls were lined with family photos, but I noticed several that used to include me were missing. A graduation portrait. A holiday photo from 2 years ago. A framed picture of me and my brother in front of the lake cabin. Gone. We sat across from each other in the living room, a polite distance between us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. "Why are you doing this?" I finally asked. Her eyes stayed fixed on the coffee table. "Because I can't keep watching you make mistake after mistake." Mistakes? I felt my voice rise. Because I didn't become a lawyer? Because I didn't marry the man you would have chosen? Because I'm living a life I want? "Because you're selfish," she snapped, her eyes locking onto mine for the first time. "Because you think the world revolves around what you want, and you never think about how your choices affect this family." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I had prepared for anger, but not for those words. Not selfish. She stood, pacing. "You used to be so close to us. You used to care. And now every decision you make feels like a rejection. You don't come home for birthdays. You barely call. You don't ask for advice. You don't even try to be part of this family anymore." I stared at her. "Because every time I try, you criticize me. You tear me apart. Do you know how exhausting it is to feel like nothing I do is ever enough?" Silence. The kind that doesn't invite an answer. We had circled around this fight before, but never like this. It felt raw, stripped of the politeness that usually softened our words. Every sentence was a confession, every accusation a wound. And beneath all of it, I heard something I hadn't heard before. Fear. Not anger, not hatred, just fear. "Do you know why I pushed you away?" she asked quietly, after a long pause. "Because it's easier to be angry than to admit I don't know you anymore. You're a stranger, Lauren. You walk into this house, and it's like someone else is standing where my daughter used to be." The room spun a little at that. I wanted to scream. I wanted to say I was still her daughter, that I hadn't changed nearly as much as she thought. But a part of me knew she was right. I had changed. I had grown into someone who wanted a different kind of life, and in doing so, I had stepped out of the mold she had built for me. "I'm still here," I whispered. "I'm still me." She shook her head. "No, the girl who needed me is gone." And there it was, the real truth. Not that she hated me, not that she didn't love me, but that she didn't know how to love this version of me, the independent, opinionated woman who no longer sought her approval before every decision. I stood slowly. I guess we're both strangers now. When I walked back to my car, the boxes were still on the porch. The morning sun was bright, but the house behind me felt like a shadow. As I lifted the boxes into the trunk, I thought about everything we had said. The anger, the blame, the unspoken love buried underneath it all. This wasn't just about career choices or boyfriends or family dinners. It was about control, about identity, about a mother trying to hold on to the version of her daughter she understood, and a daughter trying to prove she didn't need permission to become someone new. Driving away, I glanced at the rearview mirror and watched the house grow smaller. It struck me that maybe this wasn't a breaking point after all. Maybe it was the inevitable consequence of two people growing in different directions and forgetting how to meet in the middle. Maybe we had both been too proud, too stubborn, too afraid to admit we were hurting. But if this was the end, it was an ending built on silence. And silence has a way of echoing long after the words stop. The apartment didn't feel quite so foreign anymore. The boxes were unpacked, the second-hand couch was in place, and I'd hung a few framed photos, ones that didn't sting to look at, on the walls. Life was moving forward, even if it still felt like I was dragging a heavy shadow behind me. But no matter how many candles I lit, or how many new routines I built, one thing remained stubbornly unchanged. Every night, before I turned off the lights, my thoughts drifted back to that house and the woman inside it. It's strange how grief works. People talk about it like it's something reserved for death, but that's not true. Estrangement is a death, too, not of a person, but of a version of them you thought you'd always have. My mother wasn't gone. She was still living on Maple Street, still watering the hydrangeas and folding laundry on Sunday nights. But the woman who used to call me just to hear my voice, the one who used to leave sticky notes on my mirror before a big exam, she was gone, and mourning that version of her was harder than I expected. The first weeks after our final argument were full of noise, work deadlines, dinner plans, late-night conversations with Ethan. But once the noise settled, silence crept in. That's when the loneliness hit. It wasn't the dramatic kind you see in movies, the sobbing on the bathroom floor kind. It was quieter, more insidious. It was reaching for my phone to share a recipe and realizing I had no one to text. It was walking past a bakery and thinking, Mom would love that, before remembering she wasn't part of my daily life anymore. I tried to fill the void. I took on more projects at work, joined a weekend book club, even started volunteering at a community garden. But the emptiness wasn't something activity could fix. It wasn't about distraction. It was about absence. About a space in my life that used to be filled with a complicated, frustrating, deeply rooted love, and now just echoed. Ethan noticed it before I did. "You're quieter lately," he said one night over takeout. I shrugged, just tired, but he didn't buy it. "You know," he continued gently, "it's okay to miss her, even after everything." "I don't miss her," I lied. "I miss the idea of her." But the truth was I missed both. I missed the way she used to braid my hair on school mornings. I missed how she'd always make my favorite soup when I was sick, even if we'd been fighting. I even missed the way she'd call me 5 times in a row just to remind me to lock my car doors. I missed being known by someone so completely, even if that same person no longer recognized who I'd become. One evening, unable to sleep, I pulled out an old photo album from a box I hadn't opened yet. The pages smelled faintly of dust and lemon oil. There was one picture of us that stopped me cold. Me at 12, grinning proudly, with a medal around my neck, and her beside me, laughing so hard her eyes crinkled at the corners. I couldn't remember what she'd said to make me laugh that day, but I remembered the feeling, safety, belonging, unconditional love. It made me realize something I hadn't admitted before. Love like that doesn't just disappear. It gets buried under resentment, twisted by disappointment, reshaped by time. But it doesn't vanish. And if it's still there, maybe there's a chance to build something new on top of it. That thought scared me more than the alternative. Because building something new meant forgiving, and forgiveness, I was learning, is harder than anger. Anger gives you something to hold on to. Forgiveness asks you to let go. Still, I decided to try, not for her, for me. It started small. I wrote her a letter, nothing dramatic, nothing emotional. Just a few sentences on paper. "I hope you're doing well. I'm okay. I think about you often." I never sent it, but writing it made me feel like maybe the bridge wasn't completely burned. Maybe it was just waiting for someone to take the first step. A week later, I baked a loaf of banana bread, her favorite, and left it on her porch with a note. For old time's sake. I didn't sign my name. I didn't have to. She would know. I don't know if she ever read the note. I don't know if she threw the bread away or sliced into it with tears in her eyes. But doing it felt like a tiny rebellion against the bitterness that had been eating at me. It was proof, if only to myself, that I still had love left to give. Meanwhile, life outside of that fractured relationship moved forward. I got promoted at work. Ethan and I started talking seriously about moving in together. On paper, everything was going well. But beneath the surface, there was still a tug, a quiet longing for reconciliation I couldn't quite silence. One night, that longing turned into action. I found myself driving past Maple Street. It was late, the house dark, except for a soft glow in the living room window. I parked across the street and sat there for a while, watching the silhouette of my mother moving slowly through the house, folding laundry, turning off lights, locking the door, ordinary things, familiar things. I don't know what I expected, some dramatic epiphany maybe, but instead all I felt was a deep, bittersweet ache. That was still my mother. That was still the house that raised me. And no matter how far I tried to run from it, some part of me would always orbit that place. It was in that quiet moment, engine off and tears sliding down my cheeks, that I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for her to fix this. I wasn't going to sit around hoping time would magically heal what pride had broken. If reconciliation was going to happen, I had to be willing to risk rejection again. I had to reach out, even if she didn't reach back. The next day, I drafted a text. It was simple, almost painfully so. "Hi, Mom, I hope you're okay. I'd like to talk when you're ready." I hovered over the send button for what felt like hours. My heart raced. My palms were sweaty. Every instinct told me to delete it and stay safe behind the wall I'd built. But love isn't about safety. It's about trying, even when it hurts. I hit send, and then I waited. The reply didn't come that night, or the next, or the one after that. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt, then fell when it was just a group chat or a work email. It was humiliating. How much power a single unanswered message could have over me. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I had taken the first step, and that was enough. But the truth was I needed her to take one too. By the fourth day, I convinced myself I wasn't going to hear back at all, that she had read the message, rolled her eyes, and gone back to her crossword puzzle. But then, on a quiet Sunday morning, as sunlight poured through the blinds and the smell of coffee filled my apartment, my phone buzzed again. This time it was her. "I think I'm ready to talk. Sunday, 2 p.m., if you still want to." I stared at the screen, rereading it over and over. There were no apologies, no softened edges. Just a time, a place, and a choice, if you still want to. And I did. The hours leading up to that meeting felt like preparing for an interview with the past. I tried on 3 different outfits before settling on something simple. I practiced what I might say, then deleted the words from my mind because none of them felt right. What do you say to someone who raised you and then cast you out? What do you say when you still love them, but you're not sure they love you back? I arrived 10 minutes early. The cafe she'd chosen was one we used to visit when I was in high school. The kind with mismatched chairs, overwatered ferns, and a chalkboard menu that never changed. She was already there, sitting by the window with a cup of tea cradled between her hands. For a moment I just watched her. She looked smaller somehow, older. Her hair was grayer than I remembered, and for the first time I realized that as much as I'd been hurting, so had she. "Hi," I said softly as I approached. "Hi," she replied, her voice measured but not cold. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that is heavy with unsaid words. I fiddled with the sugar packet on the table, tearing the edge just to give my hands something to do. Finally she spoke. "I read your message," she said. I wasn't sure if I should reply. "I'm glad you did." Another pause. Then, almost too quietly to hear, "I've missed you." It was astonishing how 3 simple words could crack something open inside me. "I've missed you too," I whispered. What followed wasn't a dramatic, tearful reconciliation. It was awkward, clumsy, and sometimes painful. We talked, really talked, for the first time in years. About the fights, about the expectations, about the love that had gotten lost somewhere along the way. I was scared, she admitted at one point, her voice trembling. Scared that I'd failed you, that I hadn't prepared you for the world, that if I stopped pushing, you'd fall. I know, I said, but sometimes it felt like you didn't trust me to stand. Her eyes welled with tears. I didn't know how to stop being your protector. And I didn't know how to stop needing your approval. We sat there, mother and daughter, two flawed women, trying to unlearn years of hurt. It wasn't easy. We didn't solve everything in that single conversation. But for the first time, I saw her not as a judge or an antagonist, but as a person. A woman shaped by her own fears and regrets, just as I was shaped by mine. Before we left, she reached across the table and took my hand. I can't promise I'll get everything right, she said. I don't know how to be the mother you need, but I want to try. And for the first time in a long time, I believed her. The weeks that followed weren't perfect. We stumbled, we miscommunicated. Old habits tried to creep back in, but slowly, painfully, we built something new. Not the mother-daughter relationship we used to have, but a different one, a more honest one. One where boundaries existed, but love did too. One afternoon, while helping her sort through some old boxes in the attic, I found something I'd never seen before, a leather-bound journal tucked away beneath a pile of photo albums. My mother's handwriting filled the pages. It was a record of the years after my father left, when money was tight and loneliness heavier. But what struck me most were the entries about me. March 14th, Lauren got into the gifted program. I cried in the bathroom after she went to bed. I don't think she saw. I hope she never knows how terrified I am that I'll mess her up. September 22nd, she says she hates me. I know she doesn't mean it, but I still feel it like a knife. I don't know how to show her I'm proud of her without sounding like I'm disappointed too. June 5th, she told me she doesn't need me anymore. And I smiled and said, I know. Then I locked myself in my room and sobbed. I closed the journal with shaking hands. All my life I had seen her as controlling, overbearing, impossible to please. I had never considered that maybe her control was just fear in disguise. That maybe her anger wasn't hatred, but heartbreak. That maybe every cruel word was just a clumsy way of saying, I love you and I don't know how to let go. I walked downstairs, journal still in hand, and she looked at me with a kind of panic, as if I'd uncovered a piece of herself she had never intended to share. You were always doing your best, I said softly. Tears filled her eyes. I never wanted to hurt you. I know, I said. And for the first time, I meant it. Forgiveness isn't a single act. It's not a switch you flip or a magic word you speak. It's a decision you make again and again to understand instead of blame, to listen instead of shout, to let love win even when anger is easier. And in that attic, holding the weight of her words in my hands, I decided to keep choosing it. It's strange how healing creeps in. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks or sweeping cinematic music. It slips in quietly, a phone call that lasts 5 minutes longer than the last one, a lunch where no one mentions the past, a hug that lingers half a second longer than it used to. That's how it was for my mother and me. After I found the journal, something shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, not yet, but it was understanding. And understanding changes everything. It softens the sharpest memories, reframes the ugliest arguments, and turns anger into something more complicated, something closer to compassion. We started seeing each other every Sunday, sometimes at her house, sometimes at mine. At first, the conversations were light and careful, like we were learning a new language and afraid to mispronounce the words. But little by little, we went deeper. We talked about the things we had both been too afraid to say. "I was terrified you'd end up like me," she confessed one afternoon, as we sat on her porch, sipping iced tea in the late summer sun. "What's so bad about being you?" I asked. "You don't understand," she said. "I had dreams once. I wanted to travel, to go back to school, to do something more. But then your father left, and life got small. And I promised myself you would never feel trapped the way I did. But when you started making choices I didn't understand, it felt like you were throwing away everything I sacrificed for you." I didn't know what to say. All my life, I had thought her disappointment was about control. I never realized it was about fear. Fear that my choices would make her sacrifices meaningless. "I wasn't throwing it away," I said finally. "I was trying to build something different. Because of you, not in spite of you." She was quiet for a long time. Then she reached over and took my hand. I think I needed to hear that more than you know. Moments like that became the foundation of our new relationship. Not perfect, not easy, but real. We still disagreed about plenty of things. She still asked too many questions about my life, and I still rolled my eyes more often than I should. But beneath it all, there was a growing trust, a shared understanding that we were no longer enemies. We were allies, even if we were still learning how to be. Then came the day she surprised me. It was a Sunday in early autumn, and she invited me to dinner at the house on Maple Street. My first time there since the day she told me I didn't live there anymore. I almost said no. I wasn't sure I was ready to cross that threshold again. But something in her voice convinced me. "I'd like to cook for you," she'd said. "Like I used to." When I arrived, the smell of rosemary chicken and roasted vegetables hit me before I even rang the bell. The door opened before I could knock. She was standing there, apron dusted with flour, her expression nervous but hopeful. "Welcome home," she said. For a second, I couldn't speak. Home. She hadn't used that word in years. It was just 2 syllables, but it carried the weight of every fight, every silence, every apology. And somehow it felt like a door swinging open again, not just the one in front of me, but one deep inside. Dinner was simple. We talked about work, about the garden she'd planted, about the neighbor's new dog. But there was a tenderness in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that this was more than a meal. It was a truce, a beginning. After dessert, she handed me a small envelope. Inside was a key, the same one I'd left behind the day she told me I no longer lived there. "I don't expect you to use it," she said, her voice trembling. "But I want you to know you always can." Tears blurred my vision. "Thank you," I whispered. I still live in my apartment. That key sits on my nightstand, not because I need it, but because it reminds me that the door is there, and that I am welcome to walk through it whenever I choose. It's a symbol of everything we've fought for: forgiveness, understanding, the courage to keep trying. A few months later, I decided to do something I had resisted for a long time. I invited her to meet Ethan's parents. It felt like a risk, a test of how far we'd come. But the dinner went better than I could have imagined. She was warm, even charming. She asked about their lives, their family, their hopes for us. When Ethan and I left that night, he squeezed my hand. "She's trying," he said. And for the first time, I believed it wasn't just trying, it was healing. The truth is, rebuilding a relationship isn't about erasing the past. It's about weaving it into a new story, one that acknowledges the pain but doesn't end with it. It's about learning that love isn't a feeling you either have or you don't. It's a choice you make again and again, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. And it's about realizing something I wish I'd known all along. Forgiveness isn't about saying it's okay. It's about saying it hurt, but I'm choosing to move forward anyway. My mother and I still have our moments. We still fall into old patterns sometimes. But now, instead of letting them define us, we talk about them. We laugh about them, and then we try again. One evening, as we were cleaning up, after another Sunday dinner, she turned to me and said, "I'm proud of you, Lauren, not because of what you've achieved, just because of who you are." It was a simple sentence, but it healed more than any apology ever could. If you had told me 2 years ago that my mother and I would laugh together again, real laughter, the kind that shakes your shoulders and waters your eyes, I would have said you didn't know us. I would have said the damage was too deep, the silence too long, the hurt too sharp. But standing in her kitchen now, watching her carefully frost a cake for my birthday, I realize how much can change when two people decide that love is worth the work. This isn't a fairy tale ending. It's not the kind where everything broken is magically fixed and every scar vanishes. Some scars stay, some conversations still sting. We still have our moments, tense pauses, misunderstood words, old wounds resurfacing at the wrong times. But now, instead of letting them tear us apart, we see them for what they are. Opportunities to understand each other better. The truth is, relationships, especially family, are not about perfection. They're about persistence. They're about choosing again and again to keep showing up. They're about saying, "I love you," even when you're angry. They're about learning that "I'm sorry" and "I forgive you" are two sides of the same bridge, and both people have to cross it. Looking back, I can see how far we've come. The girl who once stood on a rainy porch, stunned by the words, "You don't live here anymore," isn't gone, but she's grown. She's stronger. She's softer. She understands now that rejection doesn't mean worthlessness, and that love doesn't always look the way you expect it to. I've also learned something else, something deeper, something I wish I could go back and tell my younger self. Sometimes people hurt you not because they don't love you, but because they don't know how to love you. My mother loved me fiercely, but fear distorted that love. It turned into control, into criticism, into walls I couldn't climb. But once we learned to name that fear, to talk about it honestly, it stopped controlling us. And I've learned about myself too. I used to think forgiveness was a gift you gave someone else. Now I know it's also a gift you give yourself. Forgiveness frees you from anger, from resentment, from the weight of what could have been. It doesn't mean you excuse the past. It means you refuse to let the past decide your future. Our relationship today is built on honesty. I tell her when she crosses a line. She tells me when I've hurt her. We set boundaries. We respect each other's choices. And perhaps most importantly, we choose to celebrate the present instead of constantly reliving the past. Last month, we took a trip together, just the two of us. Nothing extravagant, just a long weekend by the coast. We walked along the shore, collecting seashells, ate too much seafood, argued about directions, and laughed about how terrible we both are at paddleboarding. There were moments, quiet, ordinary moments, when I looked over at her and realized we weren't just mother and daughter anymore. We were two women who had survived something hard and chosen each other anyway. That's the thing about family. It's messy, it's painful, it's complicated, but it's also resilient. And when it works, when both people commit to doing the work, it's the most powerful thing in the world. So if you're watching this and you're in that place I was, standing on a metaphorical porch, heartbroken and confused, I want you to know something. This doesn't have to be the end of your story. The words, "you don't live here anymore," don't have to be a period. They can be a comma, a pause, a chance to rewrite what comes next. Sometimes reconciliation looks like a hug. Sometimes it looks like a text message. Sometimes it never happens at all, and that's okay too. Because even if you never rebuild that bridge, you can still build peace within yourself. You can still choose to forgive, to heal, to move forward. For me, that healing led me back home. Not to the same house, not to the same version of my mother, but to a new chapter we created together. And that chapter is still being written. Thank you for staying with me through this journey, through the hurt, the silence, the reconciliation, and the healing. I hope my story reminds you that even the most broken bonds can sometimes be repaired, that love is worth fighting for, and that no matter how far you drift, there's always a way back, even if the road is longer and harder than you expected. I'm Lauren Hayes, and this was my story, the story of how a sentence that once shattered my heart became the start of something stronger. Thank you for watching. I wish you peace, health, and happiness. And may your family always find its way back to one another. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of the ones you love. My name is Sophia Hartfield, and if you had told me 2 years ago that I'd be digging through trash behind a foreclosed mansion just to survive, I would have laughed at you. Yet there I was, 32 years old, knees deep in a dumpster at 7 in the morning, pulling out a broken chair leg and trying to convince myself it still had resale value. My hands were filthy, my stomach empty, and my ex-husband's last words echoed mercilessly in my head. Nobody's ever going to want a broke, homeless woman like you. This, the smell of rotting garbage, the cold bite of October air, the humiliation of being invisible, was what rock bottom looked like. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was quiet, degrading, and endless. I'd been a straight-A student, a promising architecture graduate with a dream to build spaces that shaped lives. But 10 years of marriage to the wrong man had stripped all of that away. Now, my degree collected dust, my savings were gone, and the only projects I had were discarded furniture pieces I could restore and sell online for scraps. Then it happened. As I stood wiping grime on my jeans, a voice behind me said, "Excuse me, are you Sophia Hartfield?" I turned, startled. The woman before me looked like she had stepped off the pages of a fashion magazine. Crisp designer suit, polished heels, not a hair out of place. I felt like a ghost in comparison. That's me, I mumbled, holding up the chair leg. If you're here to repost something, this is all I own. She smiled gently. My name is Victoria Chen. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Theodore Hartfield. Time stopped. My heart pounded in my chest. Uncle Theodore, the man who had raised me after my parents died. The man who taught me how buildings breathe and why architecture matters. The man who'd disowned me a decade ago when I chose marriage over career. Your great-uncle passed away 6 weeks ago, Victoria continued, her tone softening. He left you his entire estate. I stared at her, words caught in my throat. Uncle Theodore, gone. And he'd left everything to me. It didn't make sense. He'd cut me out of his life, refused my calls, ignored my letters. And yet, here was this stranger, telling me I was heir to a fortune I didn't even know still existed. But there was more. There's always more. You are the sole heir, Victoria said, to a $50 million estate. That includes his Manhattan residence, his Ferrari collection, investment properties, and controlling shares in Hartfield architecture. Currently valued at roughly $47 million. $50 million. It sounded like a number from someone else's life, not mine. Not the life of a woman sleeping in a storage unit, living off peanut butter crackers and scrubbing furniture she found in alleyways. There is one condition, Victoria added. Of course there was. You must take over as CEO of Hartfield Architecture within 30 days and remain in that position for at least 1 year. If you refuse or fail, the entire estate will be donated to the American Institute of Architects. I laughed, a hollow, disbelieving laugh. I haven't worked a single day as an architect. I graduated at 21. Married at 22. My husband told me my degree was a cute hobby. Victoria's gaze didn't waver. Your uncle believed you'd come back to it someday. This is his way of giving you that chance. That night, as I sat in a hotel room far nicer than any place I'd lived in years, I scrubbed grime from under my fingernails and stared at the stranger in the mirror. Hollow cheeks, tired eyes, hair hanging limp and lifeless. This was the version of me that Richard, my ex-husband, had created. A woman who'd traded her dreams for a ring and a white picket fence, only to end up alone and humiliated. I thought back to the girl I had been at 21, standing proudly beside my first-place design project, glowing under Uncle Theodore's praise. You're going to change the world, he'd said. Next year you'll join my firm and we'll make history together. But Richard had walked into that gallery like a storm I didn't see coming. Successful, charming, older, he'd swept me off my feet. Within 6 months we were engaged, within 8 married. And within a year my dreams were shelved in favor of settling down. It started small. Why stress about a job when I make enough for both of us? But soon his care became control. He discouraged me from taking the licensing exam. He sabotaged freelance opportunities. When I tried to design additions for neighbors, he booked sudden trips so I'd miss deadlines. Eventually, I stopped trying. And just like that, a decade slipped away. Now, sitting alone with a folder full of deeds, stock certificates, and photographs of a life I'd abandoned, I felt something stirring that I hadn't felt in years. Anger. Not just at Richard, but at myself, for believing him, for shrinking myself to fit into his world, for forgetting the woman Uncle Theodore believed I could become. I could walk away, Let the estate go to some institute. Go back to scrounging for scraps and trying to sell refurbished furniture online. But I knew that wasn't the choice Theodore had left for me. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a lifeline and a challenge. I pressed my palm against the window, watching the city lights shimmer below. "I'll do it," I whispered to my reflection. "I'll take the job." Victoria had told me we'd fly to New York the next morning to meet the board. I had 29 days to prove I could lead a company I'd never worked for in an industry I'd abandoned. But for the first time in years, I felt something stronger than fear: purpose. I had nothing left to lose and everything to rebuild. The next morning, I stood in the hotel lobby with my single garbage bag of possessions. Victoria smiled when she saw me. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," I said. "Good," she replied. "Because once we land in New York, everything changes." I glanced down at the bag, one suitcase of clothes, my laptop, and 17 notebooks filled with 10 years of secret designs. They were the only remnants of the woman I used to be, and maybe, just maybe, they were the blueprint of the woman I was about to become. The private jet sliced through the clouds like a silver arrow, and as Manhattan's skyline began to emerge beneath us, I couldn't help but feel like I was being airlifted from one life into another. Just yesterday, I'd been sleeping in a storage unit, waking up to the sound of garbage trucks. Today, I was on my way to inherit a company I hadn't set foot in since college. My heart was a hurricane, fear, excitement, disbelief, all swirling together. "Are you nervous?" Victoria asked from across the aisle, looking effortlessly composed as she sipped her espresso. "I don't think nervous covers it," I admitted. "Terrified, overwhelmed, mostly terrified." "That's normal," she said. "What's not normal is dumpster diving one day and running a $50 million architecture firm the next. Give yourself grace. This is a second chance, rare and worth fighting for." When we landed, a black car whisked us through Manhattan's busy streets until it turned down a tree-lined block and stopped in front of a building I'd only ever seen in Architectural Digest, the Hartfield Estate. It was everything Uncle Theodore had stood for, a seamless blend of Victorian grandeur and modern innovation. Solar panels disguised as roof tiles, smart glass windows that adjusted to light, landscaping that seemed more like art than maintenance. "Welcome home," Victoria said softly. The front door opened before I could respond, revealing a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a familiar smile. "Miss Hartfield," she said warmly, "I'm Margaret. I was your uncle's housekeeper for 30 years. And I looked after you, too, after your parents passed." Memory flashed, a gentle hand pushing a bowl of soup toward me when I refused to eat. A soft voice humming me to sleep after the nightmares. "Margaret," I breathed, hugging her. "Thank you for everything." "Your uncle never stopped hoping you'd come back," she whispered. Inside, the estate was a living museum of architectural philosophy. Original crown molding met sleek steel lines, and art hung beside engineering diagrams. It wasn't just a house, it was a manifesto that architecture isn't about walls and roofs. It's about how people live, breathe, and feel inside them. Then Margaret showed me something that took my breath away. He had the 5th floor converted into a studio, she explained as we climbed the grand staircase. "He did it 8 years ago, for you." I froze. 8 years ago, but we weren't even speaking. She nodded, a sad smile crossing her lips. He said you were too talented to stay buried forever. He wanted this space ready when you found your way home. The door opened and I stepped into what could only be described as an architect's paradise. Wall-to-wall windows bathed the space in golden light. Massive drafting tables, high-end workstations, drawers brimming with sketch paper, and on the far wall, pinned under a small brass tack, was the design that had won me my first architecture competition at 21. I touched it with trembling fingers. He'd kept it all this time. Mr. Hartfield told me once, Margaret said quietly, that your talent was never lost. Just waiting. I swallowed hard. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as a failure, not as a cute hobbyist, but as the architect I was meant to be. The next day, reality hit. The board meeting. Hartfield Architecture's headquarters occupied 3 glass-walled floors in a midtown skyscraper, buzzing with the hum of creative energy. Yet when I walked in, conversations stopped. Heads turned. Eyes scanned me, the woman who had never built a single structure, now the boss of them all. Ladies and gentlemen, Victoria announced as we entered the boardroom. This is Sophia Hartfield, Theodore's great niece and the incoming CEO. The silence was icy. With respect, said a man in his 50s, leaning back in his chair. Miss Paquette, Hartfield has never worked a day in this industry. This decision shows Theodore wasn't thinking clearly. I took a deep breath. The old me, the one Richard trained to shrink and apologize, would have wilted under that scrutiny. But that woman was gone. Actually, Mr. Carmichael, I said, steady and firm. My uncle was thinking clearly. He knew this firm needed fresh vision, not the same old guard clinging to past glory. I pulled a worn notebook from my bag and slid it across the table. This is a sustainable mixed-use development I designed 3 years ago. Rain gardens, green roofs, passive solar systems. I have 16 more notebooks like this, 10 years of designs created in secret, because my ex-husband thought architecture was a cute hobby. Carmichael's expression didn't change, but others leaned forward, curious. Even if your designs are good, a woman challenged. Running a firm requires business acumen, client relationships, project management. You're right, I said. And that's why I'll rely on the existing team, especially Mr. Sterling. Heads turned as Jacob Sterling, tall, sharp-eyed, and far more charismatic than I expected, stepped forward. I'm Jacob Sterling, he said, extending a hand. Senior partner. Worked with Theodore for 12 years. The Jacob Sterling? I asked. You designed the Seattle Public Library expansion. Your integration of biophilic design principles was brilliant. His eyebrows lifted. You know my work. I know everyone's work, I said. I may not have practiced, but I never stopped studying. A flicker of respect crossed his face. Then you're not just Theodore's charity case. Good, because the board is going to test you immediately. Let them, I replied. I've spent a decade being underestimated. I'm done playing small. That night, I returned to the estate exhausted but strangely alive. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving, I was fighting back. I opened my old notebooks and pored over them until sunrise. The early sketches were clumsy imitations of Theodore's style, but as the pages turned, something shifted. I saw my voice emerging, a fusion of sustainability and classical structure, timeless yet innovative. Richard's opinion, his mockery, his dismissal didn't matter anymore. It never had. The next morning, I walked into the office with my head high. I wasn't the woman who'd been told she was too fragile to work, too inexperienced to lead, too broken to matter. I was Sophia Hartfield, and I was ready to prove that the dream I'd buried wasn't dead. It had just been waiting for me to come back and claim it. And as I stood before the skyline of the city that would become my proving ground, I realized something profound. This wasn't about inheriting a company. It was about reclaiming my destiny. By the third week in New York, I'd learned one undeniable truth about running a legacy architecture firm. Talent and vision weren't enough. Every day felt like walking a tightrope, balancing client expectations, navigating board politics, and proving to a room full of skeptics that I was more than a sentimental appointment. And nowhere was that skepticism more concentrated than in Carmichael, the firm's senior board member and resident thorn in my side. He didn't bother hiding his contempt. Meetings were interrupted with cutting remarks about my lack of experience. Design suggestions were dismissed before I finished explaining them. And then there were the little acts of sabotage, project files misplaced, crucial emails mysteriously not forwarded, whispers in hallways questioning my leadership. But nothing prepared me for the ambush that almost ended everything before it began. It happened on the morning of the Anderson project pitch, the biggest client opportunity Hartfield Architecture had seen in 5 years. A billion-dollar tech company wanted a new Seattle headquarters, cutting edge, sustainable, and iconic. I'd spent 3 sleepless weeks with our engineers and designers perfecting the proposal. This was my chance to prove I deserved to sit at the head of the table. At 9:45 a.m. 15 minutes before the presentation, I arrived at the boardroom and my laptop was gone. Looking for this? Carmichael's voice slid across the room like oil. He was standing in the doorway, my computer in hand. Found it in the break room. Someone must have moved it. I snatched it from him, a pit forming in my stomach. The laptop booted up normally, but when I opened the presentation file, my heart dropped. The slides were scrambled, half the renderings missing, key diagrams replaced with gibberish. It was deliberate. Someone had corrupted the file. Jacob stepped into the room, clients right behind him. "Everything okay?" he asked, sensing the panic behind my forced smile. I had 30 seconds to decide, panic and postpone, admit defeat, or do the one thing Richard had always told me I couldn't, trust myself. I snapped the laptop shut and faced the clients. "Actually, Mr. Bob Anderson," I said calmly, "you mentioned you wanted a building that tells a story. So let me tell you that story from the beginning." I grabbed a marker and turned to the whiteboard. It started shaky, but as soon as the pen touched the surface, muscle memory took over. I sketched the building's silhouette, narrating the design's evolution, how the curves were inspired by the natural flow of the Puget Sound, how every line served both form and function. I explained how the building would breathe with its environment, optimizing light, airflow, and energy. Traditional architecture, I said, treats buildings as static. But this structure would be alive, adapting, responding, evolving. I drew airflow patterns, rainwater collection systems, solar panel placements. I showed how smart glass would darken in summer to reduce cooling needs and open in winter to capture solar heat. 45 minutes later, the board was covered in diagrams, arrows, notes, and sketches, raw, unpolished, but pulsing with the same passion that had driven me to study architecture in the first place. Anderson stood, studying the whiteboard. "This," he said, "is exactly what I was looking for. Someone who sees buildings as living systems." "When can you start?" The room erupted in relieved applause. Jacob grinned from ear to ear. "That," he whispered as the clients left, "was extraordinary." But my victory was bittersweet. Someone had tried to destroy my credibility, and I knew exactly who. That evening, I called an emergency board meeting. Victoria, acting as legal counsel, sat beside me. "This morning," I began, "my presentation files were deliberately corrupted. The modifications were traced to Mr. Carmichael's office." Carmichael shifted in his seat. "I was reviewing files. If something was modified, it was accidental." "Accidental?" Jacob shot back. "Every backup was corrupted." Carmichael's mask slipped. "I was testing you. Theodore left this company to an untested amateur. I wanted to see if you'd crumble." I stood slowly. "I spent 3 months living out of a storage unit, Mr. Carmichael. I sold trash to afford food. Your little stunt doesn't even register. But sabotaging company property? That does. You'll resign immediately. We'll buy out your shares at market value, and you'll sign a non-disparagement agreement. Otherwise, I'll pursue legal action for corporate sabotage." He left without a word. After the meeting, Jacob approached me with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "Where did that come from?" I laughed shakily. 3 months of eating garbage and binge-watching Succession. "Seriously," he said. "Theodore would be proud." He always said the mark of a leader isn't in celebrating success, it's in how you handle those who try to tear you down. His words stayed with me, because in the days that followed, I realized Theodore's legacy wasn't just in blueprints and buildings, it was in the way he led. He demanded brilliance, but encouraged failure. He believed creativity flourished in freedom, not fear. And now, it was my turn to embody that philosophy. I started by shifting how Hartfield operated. Design teams were given more autonomy. Junior architects were invited to pitch ideas directly. Weekly innovation forums encouraged experimentation without fear of failure. Slowly, the energy inside the office changed. People stopped whispering about the girl who'd never worked a day and started talking about the CEO who was rewriting the rules. But I wanted to go further. One night, staring at Theodore's old sketches, an idea struck me, one that could reshape the future of architecture itself. The Hartfield Fellowship. It would offer paid internships to students from underrepresented backgrounds, students who couldn't afford unpaid work or fancy graduate programs. They would receive mentorship, real project experience, and a chance to contribute to designs that shaped the world. Most importantly, they'd get to see Theodore's original working portfolios, messy, imperfect, full of crossed-out ideas, proof that greatness is built from failure. Jacob was skeptical at first. It's expensive, time-consuming. That's the point, I replied. We're not just building structures. We're building people. Future architects who will design for communities we've ignored for too long. He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded. Theodore would have loved that. And just like that, the woman who'd been told her degree was cute and impractical was now reshaping an entire industry. But leadership isn't just about building, it's about breaking, too. Breaking cycles of doubt. Breaking through resistance. Breaking down the lies that once convinced you that you were small. I had come into Hartfield architecture as a question mark. By the end of that first quarter, I was no longer asking if I belonged. I was proving that I did, and that I was only getting started. Success has a strange way of drawing ghosts out of hiding. The stronger I became, the more confident I felt leading the firm, shaping its future, and defying everyone who said I couldn't, the more the past tried to claw its way back. And as much as I wanted to keep moving forward, some ghosts refused to stay buried. It started with a message. Congratulations on your inheritance. Guess you landed on your feet. We should talk. Yita. I stared at the text on my phone, the letters blurring. R. Richard. Of course it was him. I hadn't spoken to my ex-husband since the day the divorce papers were signed. The man who called my education a cute hobby. The man who took everything in the settlement, the house, the cars, the savings, leaving me with a suitcase and a stack of legal aid brochures. Now, suddenly, he wanted to talk. Jacob noticed my silence. Everything okay? I showed him the message. His jaw tightened. Want me to handle it? I shook my head. No, I'm done giving him space in my life. And with a few taps, I blocked his number. But Richard didn't stop there. A week later, he messaged one of our interns on LinkedIn, claiming to be an old friend and asking about me. Noom. She forwarded the message immediately. I blocked him again. Then came the email from his lawyer, a request for a business meeting to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. He's trying to weasel back into your life now that you're successful, Jacob said, his voice sharp with anger. I know, I replied calmly. And he's about to learn he's not part of this story anymore. I had Victoria draft a formal letter. Miss Hartfield has no interest in any personal or professional relationship with Mr. Foster. Any further contact will be considered harassment and pursued legally. That should have been the end of it. But Richard wasn't done rewriting history. I started hearing whispers, friends reaching out, acquaintances sending screenshots, stories Richard was telling anyone who'd listen. That I had manipulated a dying old man into leaving me his company. That I'd stolen the firm by exploiting family connections. That I was unstable, vindictive, and ungrateful. At first, the gossip infuriated me, but then something inside me shifted. I realized it didn't matter. Richard was grasping for control in the only way he knew how, by twisting a narrative he no longer belonged to. And the people who mattered didn't believe him anyway. It was around that time that Margaret handed me something that changed everything, a leather-bound journal, worn and faded, with Theodore Hartfield embossed on the cover. "Your uncle kept this," she said. "You should read it." I spent the next several nights in the study, devouring every page. It wasn't a business journal, it was a deeply personal account of the last 15 years of his life. And it was filled with me. March 15th, 10 years ago, Sophia married Richard Foster today. I refused to attend. Margaret says I'm being stubborn. Maybe. But I can't watch someone I love walk willingly into a cage. July 22nd, 8 years ago. Started building the 5th floor studio today. Margaret thinks it's foolish, but I need to believe she'll come home. The studio is my act of faith. December 20th, 6 months ago, Sophia filed for divorce. Thank God. The battle ahead will be brutal, but she's stronger than she knows. March 8th, 8 weeks ago. I'm dying faster than expected. Victoria will find Sophia after I'm gone. The rest is up to her. Either she'll take the challenge, or she'll find her own path. Either way, she'll be free. I closed the journal, tears streaming down my face. For years, I'd believed Theodore hated me, that he'd cut me off because I'd disappointed him. But the truth was so much more complicated. He wasn't angry. He was heartbroken. And everything he'd done, the studio, the will, the conditions, had been part of a plan to help me find my way back. When Jacob arrived that night, I handed him the journal. He read it silently, then looked up with an expression I'll never forget, a mix of awe, sadness, and understanding. "For what it's worth," he said softly, "Theodore was right. The woman who walked into that boardroom could never have existed without everything you went through." "He mentioned you," I said, my voice trembling. "Said you'd help me." Jacob nodded. "He talked to me about you a year before he died. He said his brilliant niece was wasting her life, and when she finally escaped, she'd need someone who wouldn't try to control her. He made me promise I'd support you. Is that why you're helping me?" I asked. "Because of him?" "It started that way," Jacob admitted. "But now I'm doing it because every day I see you becoming more yourself. That's not obligation. That's admiration." He took my hand gently. "And if I'm being completely honest, it's more than admiration. But I'm not going to push you. You've just come out of a terrible marriage. You set the pace." I stared down at our hands. "What if I want to be ready?" Jacob smiled, his eyes soft. "Then we'll figure it out, together." We stood on the rooftop that night, the Manhattan skyline glittering around us, and for the first time in years, I felt something I'd thought was gone forever, hope, not just for my career, but for my heart. Because the truth was, Theodore hadn't just left me a company, he'd left me the courage to rebuild myself from the ruins. And Jacob, he wasn't here to complete me. He was here to walk beside me as I completed myself. But just as I was beginning to embrace this new chapter, the past made one more desperate attempt to drag me down, this time, with lawyers, lawsuits, and accusations that threatened everything I'd built. And once again, I would have to prove that the woman Richard tried to destroy was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and utterly unstoppable. By the time spring arrived in New York, my life had changed beyond recognition. The firm that once viewed me as an outsider now listened when I spoke. My designs weren't just being considered, they were being built. And the Hartfield Fellowship, which had started as a hopeful idea scribbled in my notebook, had already brought in its first class of bright, determined students. They reminded me of who I'd once been, passionate, terrified, hungry to prove themselves, and mentoring them reignited a fire in me I hadn't felt in a decade. But amid all the progress, something else had taken root, quietly and unexpectedly: love. Jacob and I had become more than colleagues, more than co-CEOs navigating board meetings and design reviews. Late nights spent refining blueprints turned into dinners, where we shared stories about our pasts. Strategy sessions spilled into long walks through Central Park. And the walls I'd built around my heart, the ones Richard had so carefully constructed brick by brick, began to crumble. Still, part of me resisted. I worried I was repeating old mistakes, confusing gratitude for affection, partnership for dependency. But Jacob was nothing like Richard. Where Richard had clipped my wings, Jacob wanted to see me fly. He never told me what I should do. He asked what I wanted. He didn't try to outshine me. He stood beside me, always steady, always supportive. One evening, after a particularly grueling board meeting, Jacob joined me on the rooftop garden of the Hartfield estate. The city stretched below us, glittering like a promise. "You handled Carmichael's resignation better than anyone else could have," he said, leaning against the railing. "I gave him a choice, not a punishment," I replied. "That's leadership, right?" He smiled. "That's you, stronger than you know." Silence settled between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that speaks volumes. And before I could overthink it, I turned to him. "Hey, Jacob, why are you doing this? Why stay? You could have taken over the company yourself." He studied me for a long moment. "Because I believe in what we're building. Because I promised Theodore I'd help you. But mostly because I care about you. More than I ever expected to." My breath caught. There it was, simple, sincere, without conditions. And in that moment, I knew the truth. I wasn't falling back into an old pattern. I was building something entirely new. But even as love blossomed, the universe wasn't done testing me. 2 months later, during a quarterly board meeting, Patricia, one of the senior members, slid a document across the table. "Marcus Chen's firm is offering $300 million to acquire Hartfield Architecture," she said. The room went silent. My breath hitched. $300 million. Marcus Chen was a notorious rival, a man who'd spent months publicly questioning our methods, criticizing the fellowship, and predicting our failure. Now, he wanted to buy us outright. "It's a generous offer," Patricia said gently. "Given your 51% ownership, the decision is yours." I stared at the papers, imagining what that money could do. I'd be financially secure for life. No more stress, no more late nights, no more battles. But it would also mean losing control of the firm, of the fellowship, of everything Theodore and I had built. Marcus could dissolve our programs, erase our philosophy, stamp his name over our legacy. Jacob's voice broke through the storm of thoughts. "This is a trap," he said firmly. "He's trying to eliminate the competition." I closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "No," I said simply. "Sophia," Patricia said softly, "that's a lot of money." "At least think about it." "I don't need to," I replied. "Theodore didn't leave me this company so I could sell it to someone who represents everything he fought against. Hartfield architecture isn't for sale." For a moment, the board was silent. Then Patricia smiled. "That's exactly what we hoped you'd say." I frowned. "Hoped?" She pulled out another document. "There's something we weren't allowed to disclose until you'd been CEO for a full year and rejected a substantial acquisition offer. Theodore set up an additional trust, $30 million unrestricted. His final test." I sat back, stunned. Even in death, Theodore was still shaping my journey, still challenging me to prove that I valued purpose over profit. And he was right to... Because a year earlier, I might have sold. I might have traded mission for money, legacy for comfort. But now, I understood that this company wasn't just his dream anymore. It was mine too. After the meeting, Patricia pulled me aside and handed me a small velvet box. "One more thing," she said. "Theodore asked me to give you this once you passed the final test." Inside was a simple gold band, etched with the faint lines of architectural blueprints. A note accompanied it, written in Theodore's familiar hand, "Sophia, this ring belonged to my wife, your great-aunt Eleanor, one of the first female architects of her generation." She faced obstacles you can't imagine, but never compromised her vision. When she died, I promised to give this to someone worthy of her legacy. That someone is you. Build bravely. Live boldly. And never let anyone make you small again. I slipped the ring on my finger, tears pricking my eyes. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for me all along. That night, standing in the studio Theodore had built for me 8 years before I was ready to use it, Jacob wrapped his arms around me from behind. "You know what I think," he murmured. "Theodore knew you'd pass every test. Because you already had something Marcus Chen and Richard never will, the ability to see potential in problems, to value people over profit, to build up instead of tear down." I turned to face him, heart racing. And that's when he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box of his own. "Sophia Hartfield," he said, voice trembling just slightly. "I'm not doing this because of any test or timeline. I'm doing it because every day with you is better than the last. And I want a lifetime of days watching you change the world. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred my vision as I looked at the man who had stood by me through every storm. A year ago, I'd been married to someone who wanted to make me smaller. Now, I was being proposed to by someone who celebrated every part of who I was. "Yes," I whispered, then louder. "Yes. Absolutely, yes." He slipped the ring on beside Eleanor's, and the two looked perfect together, old legacy and new beginning. And for the first time since my life had fallen apart, I realized I wasn't just rebuilding. I was building something far more beautiful than I'd ever dared to dream, a future that was truly undeniably mine. The engagement should have marked the beginning of a peaceful chapter, a time to plan the future, nurture love, and focus on the legacy I was building. But life has a way of testing your strength just when you think you're finally safe. And for me, that test came from the one person I'd hoped was gone for good, Richard. I found out about the lawsuit on a cold Friday morning. Victoria called me, her voice tight. "Sophia, I wish I had better news. Richard filed a legal claim against you." I blinked in disbelief. "For what?" "He's alleging that you used marital assets to invest in Hartfield architecture, that he's entitled to a portion of your inheritance." I laughed, an ugly, incredulous sound. "Marital assets? He took everything in the divorce. I was living out of a storage unit when Theodore died." "He's arguing," she continued grimly, "that your architectural education, which he financially supported, is a marital asset that contributed to your current success." My stomach churned with rage. Richard, the man who had sabotaged every opportunity I ever had, was now trying to profit from the very success he'd once belittled. "He's not doing this for money," Jacob said, pacing the room. "He's doing it because you're engaged, because you're happy. This is revenge." Victoria nodded. "Exactly. And we're going to dismantle him piece by piece. I need anything you have, emails, texts, journals, anything that shows he actively prevented you from working." I hesitated. "I kept journals," I admitted quietly. "I wrote everything down, every comment, every argument, every time he made me feel small." "Perfect," she said. "Those journals might be the key to destroying his case." A week later, Jacob and I spent an entire afternoon in a dusty storage unit, digging through boxes I hadn't opened since the divorce. Tititu. And there they were, stacks of worn leather-bound notebooks, filled with entries that painted a devastating portrait of my marriage. "Listen to this," I read aloud from one. "Richard told his colleague that my architecture degree was a cute waste of money. When I tried to defend myself, he laughed and said I was too sensitive. Later, he told me I'd embarrassed him." Jacob's jaw clenched. "He systematically destroyed your confidence." "He tried to," I corrected. "But he didn't succeed. Because I'm still here. And now he's the one trying to take from me." The journals documented everything: how he discouraged me from applying for jobs, how he forgot to mail my licensing exam registration, how he scheduled trips during interviews I'd arranged. Page after page, year after year, a calculated campaign of control. Victoria's face hardened as she reviewed them. "This isn't just evidence," she said. "It's a roadmap of abuse. And it's going to turn his lawsuit into a disaster." We filed a countersuit within a week for emotional distress, defamation, and harassment. The preliminary hearing was set for December. Walking into that courtroom felt surreal. 3 years earlier, Richard had walked out of our marriage certain that he'd broken me. Now, I was walking in with Jacob by my side, Margaret in the gallery behind us, and the full weight of truth in my corner. Richard looked smug as we entered, his legal team lined up like soldiers. But the confidence didn't last long. The judge flipped through our evidence, emails, journals, witness statements, and his expression darkened. "Mr. Foster," the judge said coldly, "these documents suggest a sustained pattern of emotional abuse, financial control, and deliberate career sabotage. Your claim of entitlement to Ms. Hartfield's inheritance appears both legally frivolous and morally repugnant." Richard's lawyer tried to object, but the judge raised a hand. "Motion dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Foster, you are fortunate Ms. Hartfield is not pursuing criminal harassment charges. My advice: move on with your life." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He shrank in his seat, pale and silent. For the first time in a decade, I was the one watching him squirm. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. One shouted, "Ms. Hartfield, how do you feel about the ruling?" "Vindicated," I said without hesitation. My ex-husband spent 10 years convincing me I was worthless. He took everything in our divorce. And when I rebuilt my life, he tried to take that too. Today, a judge confirmed what I already knew. Richard Foster is a small man who cannot handle strong women. The clip went viral. By nightfall, other women had come forward with similar stories. Former girlfriends, colleagues, even a woman he'd briefly dated after me. Zuma. His business collapsed within months, clients fleeing as allegations piled up. And me? I felt something I hadn't felt in a decade. Free. Truly, completely free. "He can't touch you anymore," Jacob said that night as we stood on the estate rooftop. "His opinion doesn't matter. His actions don't define you." "He never did," I replied softly. And that's what Theodore was preparing me for all along. To understand that I am not defined by who tried to break me, but by how I rebuilt myself. But freedom wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something bigger. With Richard out of the picture and Theodore's final $30 million trust now unlocked, I began to dream beyond the walls of Hartfield architecture. "What if," I said to Jacob one evening, spreading sketches across the drafting table, "we used that money for something truly ambitious? A nationwide public architecture initiative, libraries, community centers, public parks, spaces built with the same care as luxury projects, but accessible to everyone." Jacob studied the plans, his eyes bright. "That's bold." "Theodore always said architecture should be democratic," I said. "Beauty and innovation shouldn't be reserved for the wealthy. This is how we honor his memory, by building something that changes lives." Jacob smiled. "Our memory," he corrected. "Because we're partners in everything." I kissed him then, tasting the salt of my own tears, not of sadness, but of liberation. For so long, I'd believed that the best revenge was success. But standing there, with the city stretched beneath us and the future laid out in blueprints, I realized something deeper. The best revenge isn't success. It's purpose. It's transforming pain into something so powerful, so meaningful, that the people who once tried to destroy you become nothing but irrelevant shadows in the story of your rise. And I was just getting started. The wedding took place 18 months after the day I climbed out of that dumpster, the day I thought my life was over. We kept it small, intimate, and deeply personal. Just 100 people, gathered on the rooftop garden of the Hartfield estate, a space Theodore had designed decades earlier with love and intention. As I walked down the aisle, Patricia, my uncle's closest friend and my chosen family, led me toward Jacob, who was waiting beneath an arch of ivy and steel, a perfect fusion of nature and structure, just like everything Theodore had taught me architecture should be. Emma stood beside me as my maid of honor. Once a nervous student in the fellowship program, she was now a full-time architect at Hartfield, designing projects that changed lives. "You changed my world," she whispered, wiping tears from her eyes. "Not just my career, my belief in what's possible." "No," I whispered back. "You did that yourself. I just opened the door." Jacob's vows were simple and beautiful. "Sophia, you taught me that partnership isn't about competition. It's about celebrating each other's strength. You make me a better architect, a better leader, a better man. I promise to see you, to challenge you, and to always believe in the impossible." Mine were harder to say without crying. "Jacob, 18 months ago I was convinced no one would ever want me. I thought I was broken. You didn't prove me wrong. You showed me I was never broken at all. I was just waiting to find someone who saw my cracks as places where light could enter." We kissed under a canopy of string lights as our family, both chosen and biological, cheered. It wasn't just a wedding. It was a declaration that love after devastation was possible, that joy after ruin was real, and that second chances weren't just about careers. They were about hearts, too. Later that night, when the laughter had faded and the champagne glasses were empty, Patricia handed us a leather portfolio Theodore had left behind. Inside were sketches, dozens of them, for projects he'd never had time to build: community centers, schools, affordable housing. A note was tucked inside: "Sophia and Jacob, these are my unfinished dreams. Now they're yours. Build them boldly, for the people who need proof that someone sees their worth. Architecture isn't just about buildings. It's about creating spaces that make beautiful lives possible. I love you both. Now stop reading and go dance with your wife." Tea. We laughed through tears and did exactly that. The following year marked the birth of our most ambitious project yet, the Hartfield Public Architecture Initiative, funded by Theodore's Final Trust and Hartfield's profits. Our mission was simple: bring world-class design to the people who needed it most. We built libraries that became sanctuaries, community centers that became cornerstones, parks and public spaces that turned forgotten neighborhoods into vibrant hubs of life. Emma led the design for the Philadelphia Community Library, her first major project as lead architect. At the ribbon cutting, she told reporters, "Architecture saved my life, not just as a career, but as proof that I could build something meaningful. Sophia taught me that buildings are more than structures. They're promises that better futures are possible." I hugged her afterward, overcome with pride. "Theodore would have loved this," I told her. "He would have loved you." Over the next 5 years, Hartfield architecture grew, not by chasing prestige, but by pursuing purpose. We designed schools in underserved neighborhoods, housing that was both affordable and beautiful, public spaces that connected people instead of dividing them. We won awards, but more importantly, we changed lives. As for Richard, he faded into obscurity. His business collapsed, his reputation destroyed by his own actions and by the testimonies of other women who came forward. I didn't feel satisfaction, not even vindication. I felt nothing at all. He was irrelevant, a footnote in a story that no longer had room for him. 5 years after taking over the company, I was invited to give the commencement address at my alma mater. Standing before a sea of young faces, I felt the weight of my journey settle into clarity. When I graduated, I had a degree, a dream, and absolute certainty about my future. And then, within a week, I abandoned all of it for a man who needed me to be small. For 10 years, I disappeared into a life that wasn't mine. But here's what I learned. You can't truly lose yourself. You can misplace yourself, but who you are, your essence, is always waiting to be remembered. When I escaped that marriage, I had nothing. No home, no money, no confidence. But I had my education, my passion, and a great uncle who believed I was worth waiting for. Some of you will follow a straight path. Others will take detours through darkness. Both journeys are valid. What matters is that you remember this. You are architects. You see potential in empty spaces. You know that strong foundations can rise from rubble. Apply that same principle to your own lives. Build yourselves with care, honesty, and courage. And when life tries to tear you down, remember, you are trained to rebuild from ruins. The applause was thunderous, but what mattered most were the students who came up to me afterward, eyes shining, telling me their own stories of failure, resilience, and hope. That evening, I returned to the estate, to the rooftop garden where Theodore had once dreamed I would stand. Jacob was inside, sketching designs for a new children's museum. Margaret was preparing dinner downstairs. I climbed up to the rooftop and stared out at the city, a skyline I'd helped shape, full of buildings that were no longer just steel and glass, but symbols of second chances. My phone buzzed, a message from Emma. Just landed the commission for the San Francisco Community Center. Your blueprint is changing the country. Thank you for believing in me. I smiled, typing back. Thank you for proving. Theodore was right about potential. You're going to outshine us all. Jacob joined me, his arm wrapping around my waist. What are you thinking about? Everything, I said. Where I was, where I am, and where we're going next. Wherever we design next, he said softly, we'll do it together. And in that word, together, was everything. Partnership, trust, love, legacy. I looked down at the rings on my finger, Eleanor's band, the symbol of resilience, and my engagement ring, the symbol of new beginnings, and I realized the truth Theodore had been teaching me all along. You can take everything from someone, their money, their home, their dignity, but you can never take their ability to rebuild. And when they rise from the ashes, they don't return to who they were before. They become something stronger, something unstoppable. I was no longer the woman Richard tried to break, no longer the girl Theodore once worried about. I wasn't even just the CEO of a powerful firm. I was an architect of buildings, of second chances, of futures built on belief. And that, I realized, was the real inheritance. So as the city lights flickered below, full of stories waiting to be written in steel and stone, I whispered a silent thank you to the man who had believed I would rise, and to the woman who finally did. Thank you for being here, I'd say to the viewers if they were listening now. Thank you for walking this journey with me. If my story reminded you of your own strength, your own power to rebuild, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it. And wherever you are, I wish you health, love, and the courage to build a life that's truly yours.